It's the Aquarius new moon today, and it's such a potent new moon for us because right now, as we're speaking, there are 6 planets aligned in the sign of Aquarius. So the sun and moon are together in Aquarius as the new moon conjunction, but they're joined also by Mercury, who's retrograde, by Venus, by Jupiter, and Saturn. So there are more than half of the planets weighted in this sign, and there's just an extraordinary emphasis on the sign of Aquarius, which is a fixed air sign. And I know some of you may be newer to astrology, and this language might not be as familiar. Some might be deep deeply initiated veterans of astrology. And so when I say that Aquarius is a fixed air sign, that refers to the element air. So we have 4 elements that are fire, earth, air, and water, that all the signs, each sign is one of those elements. And then there are there are 3 modalities, so cardinal, fixed, and mutable. And every sign has a unique signature, a unique combination of element and mode that make up what that sign is. And the fixed signs are the signs that are the middle of the season. So when the sun is passing through a fixed sign, it's the middle of winter in the case of Aquarius, or um, spring in the case of Taurus, Leo in the case of summer, and Scorpio in the case of fall. So you can really think of that fixed energy, the middle of the season, as well, being fixed. It's between the beginning and the end. It literally is the middle. And there can be um, sometimes a stubbornness or a slowness to move of the fixed signs. And they really do kind of carry that quality of holding the balance between the beginning of the season with the cardinal sign that initiates it, and the end when when the season is changing or the sign is changing. No, excuse me, when the season is changing, and so the sign is mutable, which means changing. And then the other piece that's important is the element: earth, air, water, fire. And in the case of Aquarius, it's an air sign. There are 2 other air signs, Gemini and Libra. All the same elements are in a trine with each other. It's a really beautiful thing when you look at the layout of the zodiac, that all of the same element, they always form a grand trine with one another. And so this unique signature for Aquarius of fixed middle of the season and air, where you can think of it very literally as airy, that it has this kind of upward motion. There's a yang quality to air, same with fire, just as there's more of a yin quality to earth and water. Air and fire move upward, and water and earth move downward. They're heavier. And so we can get a sense for the qualities of each of the signs based on these ingredients. Signs are like complex archetypes made up of different ingredients that include the modality and the element, but also the sign ruler. And in the case of Aquarius, traditionally Aquarius is ruled by Saturn. And I think this makes a lot of sense that the 2 signs ruled by Saturn, Capricorn and Aquarius, in the traditional system, are 2 out of the 3 signs in the winter season in the Northern Hemisphere. Capricorn begins the winter season, and Aquarius is the middle of the winter season. And then when we move into Pisces, which is the last sign of the winter season, this is a mutable water sign, a changing water sign. And I always find that interesting to think about seasonally, because it's like we get this cold Saturnian energy for the beginning and middle of winter. And Aquarius season in particular, I always get this image of a cold wind blowing across an open snowy field. And just that sense of the middle of winter, nothing grows at this time, and it's ruled by Saturn. And then when we move finally into the last sign of the season, Pisces, it's as though those snows begin to melt. We're moving towards spring. We're not there yet. Spring initiates with Aries, a fire cardinal sign. That's when the sun really starts to heat up and spring is called forth from the earth. But we're not there yet. We're at that threshold between the frozen wasteland of Aquarius and the mutable melting waters of Pisces. So many planets in the sign of Aquarius right now that are putting this emphasis on the Saturn ruled fixed air sign and the ways that this can show up in our lives in terms of a feeling of responsibility and commitment in that Saturnian way, but more um, in the realms, in the airy realms, for example, the realms of the mind or abstractions. There's a feeling of distance or aloofness that Aquarius brings in. It's harder to grasp, it's less tangible than Capricorn, which is the Saturn ruled cardinal earth sign, much more grounded, much more well Saturnian. So there's a bit of a contradiction and a paradox to Aquarius. And because of that, modern astrologers assigned as its planetary ruler Uranus, which is just somewhat a complete opposite of Saturn. And so, how significant in this moment when all of these planets are in Aquarius, that traditionally has been seen to be ruled by Saturn, by modern rulership is understood to be ruled by the awakened, quickening, innovative, revolutionary Uranus, that these two planets are in the sky in alignment with each other. And indeed, they will make their exact alignment during this lunation on February 17th. This is a longer term transit, Saturn square Uranus. Saturn, which is in the sign of Aquarius, square to Uranus, which is currently in the sign of Taurus. And we're going to be talking about Saturn Uranus, not just today, not just part of this lunation, but going forward as well, because Saturn and Uranus are going to be within orb of each other, meaning the archetypes associated with these two planets will be activated because they're within a certain number of degrees of each other in the sky. And they'll be within orb of each other all the way till 2023. So this is a long transit. It started early in 2020, although less noticeable in comparison to the Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto stellium of this past year, which was much more weighty and intense and pressured. The Saturn Uranus brings in more of the sense of the sudden and unexpected crisis. And now we did see that certainly last year as well, but I think we're noticing it even more as the Saturn Uranus alignment really tightens in. And that there are all these tensions when Saturn and Uranus are in alignment, just between the very different qualities of their archetypal nature, but also because they're in a square alignment, which in itself is imbued with that tension-filled quality. It's like they're pulling against each other in this almost awkward way. And that it can be very hard to reconcile these very different energies between Saturn and Uranus, or between any two planets that are in a square. And the dynamic tension between Saturn and Uranus in the square, it brings forward a again that tension between tradition, which is Saturnian, and innovation, which is Uranian, or between generations. There can be a lot of difficulty and disagreement between generations. The generation gap can feel very wide under Saturn Uranus alignments between the old and the young. How do elders speak to the youth? What wisdom can the youth bring to the older generations as well? And sometimes that's very fraught with friction. And sometimes there can be a very beautiful mutual collaboration between generations. There can be an impulse both to conserve the past and also to make reforms for the future. And under such alignments, it's really important to find our capacity to be flexible. Think of bamboo bending in the wind rather than a solid oak tree that might be a little too rigid and easily split by lightning striking it, and having that more solid structure crack. I find too that Saturn and Uranus can come through in a kind of a sense of awakening to responsibility. Last month, watching the US presidential inauguration, I was very struck by Amy Klobuchar's statement that the insurrection in the Capitol awakened us to our responsibility as Americans. And that phrase stuck with me because it was such a Saturn Uranus phrase. Uranus relates to awakening, to revelation, to sudden new realizations. And Saturn relates to responsibility and our ability to carry the weight, to commit to something. And so Saturn Uranus really is about awakening to our responsibilities, our commitments, and being able to envision structural change really in every arena of life. So that's the larger outer planetary context within which the lunation cycle that we'll be exploring in this workshop unfolds. And I always think it's so important to take the largest scale in first, because most of the, many, I should say, not most, many of the correlations we see in the world and the collective will reflect those larger outer planetary dynamics first. And then it's the movement of the inner planets, the more specific short-term alignments that trigger the particular expressions that come through within that larger outer planetary archetypal context. So for example, many of you might have felt this last week as Venus moved into conjunction with Saturn, an exact square to Uranus, because Saturn and Uranus are so close. So all those tensions I've been describing, you may have felt come into the Venusian realm of relationship, romantic relationship, friendship, aesthetics, beauty, style, the heart in general. So it can be a time perhaps of both heartbreak and heart awakening, a feeling both of entrapment and freedom, or finding freedom from a sense of imprisonment. Now that can be within a larger context, or very specifically within a relational Venusian context as Venus moves across that alignment. And so over these next several years, as Saturn does continue to square Uranus, and the faster moving inner planets align with this particular square, we'll see more specific influences come through, whether it's from Venus and the heart and beauty and romance, or Mercury, the mind, thinking, communication, perhaps Mars, our will to do, to achieve, to assert. That's what brings in the more specific coloration. But we need to understand that larger outer planetary context first in order to understand how the specifics are going to come through. Now, before I go into the actual lunation cycle itself for this month, I did want to make a brief announcement, and that is I'm bringing forward a new course that's going to be available online, and it's called Awakening to Archetypal Astrology. And I'm offering it through the Academy of Oracle Arts, which is the same organization that hosts these forecasts. So you'll be familiar with that organization. And this course is a 6-part course that's going to be launched in April of this year. It'll be launched online. It's an evergreen course, meaning that you could take it as soon as it's available if you are interested, or it'll be available in the long term too. And I was so excited to put this course together because it brings together many different facets of my teaching and my work that I've wanted to have in one place for a long time. So this introductory course, it lays the foundation for an astrological practice, beginning with more of a general overview, an examination of worldviews, and also the history of an archetypal perspective within astrology. And then I lay out a study of the basic principles and techniques of archetypal astrology. So, the meanings of the planets and the aspects and the zodiacal signs, how to read a natal chart and how to explore world transits, how to calculate your personal transits using an ephemeris, how to keep a transit journal. And those who take the course will be given the tools for their own ethical astrological practice. The final class is really focused on the ethics of astrology, which was something that I was really looking forward to putting into this concrete teaching form. And there is this emphasis in the course on really cultivating the capacity for deep inner reflection, relational understanding and growth, and an archetypal perception of the cosmos in which we're all embedded. And during the process of creating and filming the course, I just filmed it last week. I recognized how much this course is in so many ways a tribute to the lineage in which I learned astrology. And so I draw on the research and the um, methods and techniques that were uh, developed and then also passed on to me by my father, Richard Tarnas. And it was just this really beautiful culminating experience of filming the course, honoring this lineage, and also getting to bring in the many insights that I've learned from my own counseling practice and personal study and research. So, more information will be available on the course soon, but now that it's actually been filmed, I wanted to share this first announcement about it to anyone who is interested in going more deeply into the techniques of archetypal astrology. So, from there, let me turn now to the lunation cycle. And I'm going to bring up the chart for the transits, and this is beginning with today. It's the Aquarius New Moon. It's also the Lunar New Year for so many different traditions, and that will be celebrated tomorrow, February 12th. But it's reflective of the fact that it's the new moon today, and you can see just this extraordinary stellium aligned in Aquarius of Saturn, Jupiter, Venus, Mercury, which is retrograde, the sun, and the moon, all just beautifully in that lineup in Aquarius. Not too far away, there's Pluto at the end of Capricorn as well. And two exact alignments are occurring in the midst of um, this new moon. One of them, of course, being the new moon itself, the conjunctio of the sun and the moon, where there's a fusion of inner and outer energies, the individual with the whole. And that's always a coming back together at the new moon, where there is this sacred marriage between our solar way of being, the more assertive, agential, shining individual part, and then the lunar whole that encompasses everything. And whenever we come to a new moon, it's as though these two celestial bodies almost die into each other, that the moon disappears into uh, darkness. It is the darkest night, the new moon, where the stars are most visible. But the sun also dies into the moon's hole. And we can really see the new moon as um, a celebration of the darkness and a capacity to see the night sky, the stars. If you're a stargazer, you will know that the best time to see the stars at night is on or close to the new moon, because the light of the moon isn't dominating the night. The other exact alignment that's happening today is this Venus Jupiter conjunction. And Venus has been making quite a journey over these last couple weeks, first conjoining Pluto and then Saturn, um, making an exact square to Uranus at the same time as it conjoined Saturn. so making that square over here to Uranus, now today conjoining Jupiter. And the Venus Jupiter alignment really brings in a sense of expansive and generous love. There's such a rich, open hearted, indulgent, and luxurious quality to Venus Jupiter, a celebratory opulence that comes forward. And it can bring with it a this kind of joyful celebration of the beauty and the artistry of life. Um, it's bringing together the two benefics of traditional astrology. Venus was called the lesser benefic, and Jupiter was called the greater benefic. Although, any of us who know Venus intimately, and how Venus rules love and the heart and our relational connections, that Venus is hardly lesser, except only in size when it comes to Jupiter. But they are the two benefics, and that they really mutually enhance each other in such a lovely way. And the shadow side that can come with Venus Jupiter is when it can become too much overindulgence, spending too much money, um, taking in um, too much rich food or sweetness or sugar, where it just kind of becomes a little bit overwhelming. And after the transit has passed, we think, what was I doing? What was I thinking of? But in the midst of it, it is so lovely to be able to indulge and enjoy that opulence and that celebratory beauty that the Venus Jupiter brings forward. So that is the beginning of the lunation cycle, starting today. And the exact new moon took place at 11:06 in the morning Pacific time. So you can calculate that for your time zone. And for those of you who are working with these dynamics in terms of intention setting or new moon rituals, I would suggest really keeping that Venus Jupiter in mind as you set your intention, and looking at all the ways that you can celebrate beauty and artistry in your life and in the world around you. Because especially when one is in, difficult times, we can forget that um, goodness and beauty are an inherent part of what it means to be human, what it means to participate in the dynamic unfolding of the cosmic journey. And that even if it's not, it doesn't carry the seriousness of Saturn, that doesn't make it any less real. And so it's important to give Venus Jupiter its due when the alignment comes around. Um, and because they are so close, not only to each other, but also to the sun and the moon, they will be visible just before sunrise. So if you're an early riser, I do recommend going out right before sunrise, looking toward the eastern horizon, because um, there's nothing as beautiful as a Venus Jupiter conjunction. They are the brightest lights in our sky, other than the sun and the moon. And they just mutually illuminate each other in such an exquisite way. It's like these two shining diamonds next to each other in the heavens. So I do really highly recommend that, if you're able, or you can encourage yourself out of bed in the morning, to go out and give Venus and Jupiter their due, their honor. And it feels significant that this alignment is in the sky the week of Valentine's Day, which is such a celebration of love, and that there are so many different ways we can celebrate and honor love in our lives, that it doesn't just need to be romantic love, but all the forms of love, family love, um, the love of friendship, and the love of our companion animals, the love of our wider community. So many different ways that we can celebrate love. And I think that's such an important thing, um, to be able to honor in these times and in all times. And how significant that this alignment lands this week of Valentine's Day. So moving forward now through the lunation, I first just want to mention that The sun will ingress into the next sign, into Pisces, on February 18th, so next week. And Pisces is a mutable water sign, so it's the end of the season, as I was talking about before, end of the winter season. That snow begins to melt. And traditionally, Pisces is a Jupiter ruled sign. In the modern rulership system, it's a Neptune ruled sign, which makes so much sense in terms of it being a water sign, it being the sign of the two fishes as well. The two fishes are often seen as a symbol for Christ. And the age of Pisces, by some, such as Carl Jung, has been called the age of Christianity. Now, of course, we have to situate that within a Western Christian worldview. That's certainly not a universal statement by any means. But the the qualities of Pisces very much are related to that watery, dreamy, fantastical, mystical reverie. And when the sun splashes into that sign on February 18th, uh, our consciousness, our way of being, enters more into this permeable dream world. And we'll notice that throughout the unfolding of the month. And so just the next day, we come to the waxing quarter moon. So this is now February 19th. And the waxing quarter, the moon is in early Gemini, square to the sun in early Pisces. And this happens to take place the same day that Venus forms its exact square to Mars. And so it's interesting that they're all fairly close to each other. Venus is 9 degrees behind the sun. Mars is 9 degrees behind the moon. So it's a wide conjunction on both sides, therefore making a wide square to each other. Sun, Venus, square, moon, Mars. And so a lot of the qualities associated with Venus and Mars will be really present and shaping this next stage of the lunation cycle. And as we've spoken about in previous workshops, the waxing square, as the astrologer Dane Rujar says, is when there's crisis in action. So if we set an intention at the new moon, it's the waxing square that usually demands of us that we start to put that intention into action. It becomes an opportunity, usually through some kind of problematic push, to begin to bring forward the intention we have set. And the qualities of Venus and Mars will be very present with that. So the Venusian, again, related to the aesthetic, the artistic, the beautiful, the heart-centered, the relational. Mars being connected more to movement, athleticism, assertion, anger, aggression, friction. And the Venus-Mars dynamic is very much like the friction and dance between lovers, especially when they are at this tension-filled angle of the square. And so you may find this coming through at this particular alignment as maybe an argument with a loved one, or some kind of irritability that is present in terms of one's more intimate dynamics. But there's also the possibility to bring that tension forward more in an erotic form. Maybe that's more of an active social expression. Perhaps it's the just feeling the movement of eros in your relational connections. It very literally can be a kind of sexual friction or tension that comes through. Maybe initiating a relationship of some kind or taking it to another level. And something I always love to recommend with Venus-Mars alignments, particularly if some of the more irritable sides are coming through of that alignment, bring it to the dance floor. Because Venus-Mars is the dancer, it's the performer, it's the musician. And so put the guitar in the hands of the planetary archetypes that want to be coming through. Turn it into art, give it more form and movement. Or if you're more of the athletic type, see where you can find grace and beauty in your athletic practice, very much like the ancient Greeks did, and the original Olympics, where it wasn't just about who was fastest, who was strongest, but also who was the most graceful. And how can that come through in terms of our physical, embodied, energized expressions? Now, moving forward to the full moon, our full moon will take place in Virgo. And so you can see here that the sun in Pisces is opposing the moon in Virgo. And um, at least for those on the west coast of North America, this, or those in the Pacific time zone, this exact new moon alignment will take place just 17 minutes past midnight. So it's really in the heart of the night, in the heart of that darkness. And Venus, again, is not far behind. Venus is in the conjunction with the sun. The moon will have passed in opposition to Venus earlier that day. And so very much the quality of the sun moon opposition, the full moon, the blossoming of the cycle, your intention coming to fruition, to fullness, that will be painted over with this kind of Venusian loving, beautiful glow. And that this really kind of takes place because it's a Virgo full moon. If we think about Virgo, the Virgin, um, there's a boundaried, self-contained quality to Virgo, and something I've spoken about before in these workshops, I think quite some time ago at this point, regarding Virgo. I think it was actually when the sun was passing through Virgo, is if we contemplate the meaning of the Virgin, the original meaning of that word was that it means she who is one unto herself. And I learned that from the Jungian analyst Nancy Qualls Corbett. And so she speaks about this original meaning of virgin, she who is one unto herself. And so this full moon, we can really think of a culminating expression, the literal fullness of the moon, the complete illumination of the lunar principle. The lunar principle being our emotional and somatic and intuitive capacity. All of those ways of knowing that are different than the solar rational clarity. The way of knowing that is much more, predominantly associated with the sun, that clear light of day. Lunar knowing is different. It's imaginal, it's relational, it's emotional, it's psychosomatic. And so there's a blossoming fullness of those qualities every time we have a full moon. But in the sign of the Virgin, we can see how that almost closes in back in on itself. And perhaps something to contemplate during this particular full moon are all the ways that that you are one unto yourself, how you are both autonomous in that solar sense, but also relational within your own being, meaning how do you relate to your many parts? Because as astrology shows us, as depth psychology shows us, we are not singular. We are not but one unified ego consciousness. We are many. We are multifaceted. And that in some ways, whenever we come to the full moon, we can honor that multifaceted quality of our being within the fullness, the unified wholeness of who we are. Now, moving forward again to the waning quarter moon. This takes place on March 5th. Oh, I should mention, I don't think I said the date of the full moon, the Virgo full moon, but that takes place February 27th. And so now moving into March, we have the waning quarter moon, where the moon is in Sagittarius, and it's forming the square to the sun in Pisces still. You can see the sun at this point is flanked equally on both sides by Venus on one side and Neptune on the other. And those qualities will be even more significant when we come to the new moon. So I'll describe it when we come to the Pisces new moon in more detail, but just know that those energies are already going to be coming in at the time of the waning quarter moon. And here, when we look at the moon in Sagittarius versus the sun in Pisces, we can see the difference of that Sagittarian call to adventure, the impulse to expand, to broaden one's horizons, and then more of the Piscean impulse to um, not just dive deep, but to diffuse softly into these more introverted veils of a dreamy cocoon. And so there can be uh, once again, a tension of that 90-degree angle of the impulse to broaden, to expand, to open out. And the hopefully I'm still coming through clearly. I think the Mercury retrograde energy might be coming through a bit in um, the internet connection. So please, dear Mercury, be with us and let the transmission go through. Um, but yes, so that Piscean desire to be awash in the dreamy waters of that sign, and this especially comes to a peak when we move finally to the Pisces new moon itself. And so here you can see this just beautiful alignment in Pisces of the sun and moon. And on that day, there will be the exact Venus-Neptune conjunction as well. And the quality that's present here is, again, very Neptunian, just in terms of the sun and the moon being in Pisces, and that fantastical, imaginal, archetypal, symbolic quality that comes through, very watery. But then also the Venus Neptune conjunction, and I always think of Venus Neptune as um, like the fairy tale romance, and that it is a kind of ethereal dream world. Venus Neptune is you can just picture sirens and fairies and mermaids, and the exquisite beauty of elves singing under starlight. That's Venus Neptune. And when it comes to love, Venus Neptune can be the idealization of the dream lover. And so what we have to be aware of, what we have to watch for, is the delusional enchantment that can come in with that. With Venus Neptune, I often think of a story like Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, where there's enchantments left and right between the fairy folk and the human beings, and everything is beautiful. That's Venus. And everything is about love. That's also Venus. But it's taking place in this realm of fairy, and that there's always a question of, did one fall in love because this is genuinely who you love, or was it because there was some illusion painted, that a spell was cast over you, and you're going to wake up and realize that the dream wasn't real, that was shattered. So these are some of the qualities that are associated with Venus Neptune that will very much be coloring and shaping that next new moon. And so what a really quite beautiful and Venusian arc that we're seeing here, because Venus is so close to the sun throughout this lunation cycle. The cycle begins with the Aquarius new moon and the exact Venus-Jupiter conjunction. It's punctuated at the squares by Venus square to Mars. And then Venus ingresses into the sign of her exaltation, into Pisces. Pisces is where Venus is really kind of welcomed like an honored guest. And then staying close to the sun, we come to the um, the next new moon, which happens to take place with the exact Venus Neptune conjunction. So from a Venus Jupiter conjunction to a Venus Neptune conjunction. Um, One song that I love to listen to that honors both of these archetypal principles, Venus Jupiter and Venus Neptune, is the song Higher Love. This is a song that was written by Steve Winwood um, in the 1980s, and he's born with Venus, Jupiter, Neptune. So he's really carrying all of that, and that quality of higher love. There must be a higher love, a transcendent love. And that song was covered just spectacularly by Whitney Houston, who has Venus, Neptune. So she's carrying that um, part of the higher love more in its transcendent form rather than its expansive Jupiterian form. And then just last year in 2019, there was a fantastic remix by the house DJ Kygo, who it, of all the aspects in his chart, he's part of the Uranus Neptune generation. And you really hear that kind of sparkling, imaginative, technologically infused quality in his music. But he has a Venus Jupiter alignment in his chart. And so he did a remix of Whitney Houston's version. So you bring her Venus Neptune, his Venus Jupiter remix together, and it comes together and honors the original Venus Jupiter Neptune of Steve Winwood, the original writer of the song Higher Love. So if you want to honor that song, or excuse me, if you want to honor that alignment, both at this new moon and the next, or just throughout the month, and bring dance in there as well, it's such a great song to be able to honor those particular energies. So coming back together, there's just a few more um, alignments that I want to speak to. And that now, again, I've touched on the Saturn Uranus dynamic, which is the larger context holding all of this together. Um, Coming in more to the specifics, I just want to give you some particular dates here. One is that Mercury is retrograde right now, as I just mentioned, as I was concerned about the internet connection. And with Mercury has been retrograde since January 30th and will be until February 20th. And in that sequence, um, Mercury is moving back and forth through the sign of Aquarius. It's the first Mercury retrograde in air signs. Mercury will turn retrograde in all the air signs throughout this year, 2021. So the next retrograde will be in Gemini. The subsequent retrograde will be in Libra. That's how the Mercury retrogrades always work. It happens 3 times a year in the same element, and then the next year it moves to a different element. So last year it was water, next year it'll be earth, and so forth. So just to know that time period, January 30th, so we're well into it, through February 20th. So good to just have patience, slow down, um, re revise, rethink your communications. Don't be hasty, to quote the Ents, that Mercury retrograde really is an important time to not just charge ahead in terms of our travel plans, our communications, our ideas even, but really to sit with them more in a contemplative space. Um, and then once we come to February 20th, that's the time to kind of pick things back up and get in order and move forward. So throughout that time, as Mercury does its retrograde dance, it makes several conjunctions. First, a conjunction to Venus, which actually perfects tomorrow, February 12th. And Mercury with Venus is such a sweet spoken aspect. And words of love, even being able to say, I love you. It's such a Mercury Venus kind of statement. It's very poetical. Using words eloquently, beautifully, can be a love of language, a love of learning, love of books. Bibliophilia is a Mercury Venus quality. And in terms of its potential shadow side, we just always want to be conscious with Mercury Venus alignments of when our conversation can stay more superficial, more on the surface, more chatty, social niceties, but ignore the depth or even lose some of that potential for a more intimate or honest heart connection. So that's something to be aware of with the Mercury Venus as it comes through, perfecting tomorrow. Um, it also, Mercury has already made an alignment with Saturn, and will do so again over the course of this. And it makes this retrograde, and it makes two alignments to Jupiter. So, Mercury, our capacity to communicate, to think, to learn, to have ideas, really how we think, it's going through this strange kind of contraction when it's in alignment with Saturn, and then expansion in alignment with Jupiter. You can almost think of it taking, I don't, it's funny, this metaphor is coming forward for me right now. Being reminded of science class in high school or grade school, where you take a metal ball and you heat it up and you see how it expands, and then you freeze it and you see how it contracts. And that's kind of what's happening with the mind right now as Mercury moves back and forward in relationship to both Saturn and Jupiter. So maybe with Jupiter, things can be a little bit more long-winded, using big words, going on a bit more than one should. There's a loquaciousness. There's a potential for logorrhea, just far too many words coming forward in long run-on sentences. And then with the alignment with Saturn, it's like the editor comes in and snips all those things out and says, just focus in, just use small sentences. Don't say more than you have to. Keep quiet. Keep quiet because you said too much with the Mercury Jupiter. Value silence. And then it comes back with the Mercury Jupiter, and you're like, oh, that was just so narrow. I have so much more that I need to say. And I actually have to say even more because I held back in that silence. So there might be a variety of ways that you notice this coming through. And it could come through at a very personal level. We'll probably notice it unfolding at a collective level, and in terms of all the various political and social, larger cultural dynamics. But just be aware of that expansion and contraction and how it will take place in terms of the capacity to communicate. I mentioned that we have a couple ingressions, meaning planets moving into new signs that take place in this lunation. One is Venus moving into Pisces. That will take place on February 25th. And again, Venus loves it in Pisces. Venus is very happy in Pisces. This is Venus floating in a pool with a nice drink while she's being fanned by mermaids. That Venus does well in Pisces. So let's please enjoy this. And then the other ingression is Mars moving into Gemini, and that takes place on March 3rd. So it's so exciting to see Mars moving forward again. We had Mars in Aries for 6 months last year and into this year. And so now Mars has made its way dramatically through the sign of Taurus, and will be there for a couple more weeks. But then when Mars moves into Gemini, now Gemini is a Mercury ruled sign. And during the period of weeks that Mars spends in Gemini, you may notice Mars's fire and irritability and ire and kind of peppery argumentativeness coming through, again, more in terms of conversation and dialogue. This is very different than the Mercury-Venus conjunction that's here right now that I described. So taking place several weeks from now. And going forward for several weeks as well, as Mars is in Gemini, expect Mars to show up more in those communicative realms. And in terms of the areas of ideas and um, if you're going to get into an argument, make sure it's a good one. Make sure you're arguing for something that matters. And this is where Mars is so important. It is the righteous warrior. Um, but we want to make sure the righteous warrior is fighting on behalf of something that is worth expending its energy on, not just kind of every next thing that comes up that bothers us. So, really choose your battles wisely with that one. So overall, we can see that um, this really is a very Neptunian month. The Sun and Venus both ingressing into that watery sign of Pisces. The Sun, Moon, Venus, Neptune conjunction that will take place in March, really just bringing it all back together. And one thing to keep in mind with so much emphasis on Neptunian, Piscean, watery qualities is that um, it can be hard to keep our real world focus in those spaces. This is a time more of non ordinary states of consciousness, and that the dream world may feel more activated, that you may be more prone to daydream and reverie, and that the imagination may be especially activated. And this is something worth paying attention to. It's something worth listening to, but it's also worth being discerning around, asking yourself, what is an illusion? What really is real? And of course, in these states, the term reality even becomes fluid. And for those of you who know, some of the other work that I do in the world, I'm all about affirming imaginal reality. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be discerning. That doesn't mean we shouldn't take everything with a grain of skepticism or two, because that's when the true symbolic, archetypal, imaginal insights come forward, is when we question them. And so you may feel yourself swimming in a sea of dreams, but write those dreams down and assess them and ask questions. Why are you here? Something that I've been thinking about recently um, in terms of dream interpretation. There's so many different approaches to dream interpretation. Freud called dreams the via regia to the unconscious, the royal road into the unconscious. And that we can interpret dreams very personally, in a very personal psychological sense. We can interpret them collectively. You can look up the symbols in your dreams in a symbol book, or now we have access to such a wide array of resources to interpret our dreams symbolically through the internet. One way that I always like to interpret my own dreams is through the transits. What transit is coming through here, both in terms of the world transits and my own personal transits? Or what part of my natal chart am I seeing present in this dream? And the reason for doing that is it's almost as though the unconscious is saying, this is the aspect to pay attention to. Because we're always in the midst of so many transits. There are always just a plethora of world transits unfolding and personal transits. How do we discern? How do we differentiate what is ours, what is collective? And I actually think that the dream world can really help us with that. It says this is the one to pay attention to. This is the particular archetypal complex that's coming through right now. And so if you can identify um, who is present, which archetypes are there, as James Hillman would say, which God is here, then it's almost as though the unconscious is directing our attention toward, well, that's the transit to pay attention to for this day or this week or this month. When we get recurring dreams and we find the archetypal signature behind them, that can reflect a larger pattern that we're working through. And looking at all the areas in life where that archetypal complex may show up, that it's really calling us forward to be able to work with those specific energies at this time. So thank you all so